Before we get started, I want to give a little background on the idea of perennial yield in the Carson watershed and why it doesn't work. So with this is a chart that was developed for Carson Water Subconservancy District last year, and basically looked at perennial yield versus groundwater usage from 2013 to 2017. You will see that there are 5 groundwater basins, major basins in the Carson watershed. And I'm going to start from the lower watershed moving forward up. The different color bars, the blue is how much groundwater is pumped for irrigation. The orange is for domestic pumpage. The gray is miscible, and then the yellow color or mustard color is other usage. The dots show what the perennial yield for each groundwater basin is. If you start in the Carson Desert, and those familiar, this is in Churchill County, you'll see that the perennial yield dot is 1,600 acre-feet of water, and yet they've been pumping close to 16,000. You would think that with this usage that you would be mining the aquifer. However, because of all the groundwater and agricultural recharge that occurs, which is not part of your perennial yield analysis, there is actually a sustainable groundwater basin, even though they are pumping far more than the perennial yield. If we move into Churchill Valley groundwater basin, this is near the Silver Springs area, you'll see the perennial yield is about 2,500 acre-feet, and they are pumping close to that perennial yield. However, the majority of the water usage in this groundwater basin is from domestic use. And so we have a lot of paper water rights, as I call them, in this groundwater basin that would probably never be developed, because if you do, you will start mining the aquifer. As we move up river, we get to the Dayton Valley groundwater basin. And this one has a kind of unique because there are 2 perennial yields. There's a high perennial yield and a low perennial yield. Definition of perennial yield is typically the average sustainable water you can withdraw. But when they were doing the analysis on the Dayton, they looked at what happens during wet years versus dry years. You can see that the amount of groundwater being currently pumped is close to the perennial yield and a low supply. However, there are several sub-basins in the Dayton groundwater basins, i.e. like the Stagecoach groundwater basin, that is fully appropriated, and any additional water being pumped out of that sub-basin would actually be mine that sub-basin in the aquifer. So again, we have issues of how you define perennial yield in that area. We moved into the Eagle Valley groundwater basin. This here is where Carson City gets most of their water. You can see that the perennial yield is about 4,900 acre-feet of water, and that's currently what they pump. However, there is also what they call a safe field that's been designated by the state engineer. And this safe field analysis basically includes other water that comes in that's not naturally recharging the aquifer. And this would come from the importation from Marlette water system, and then also the capturing of Ash and Kings Canyon creeks that are then recharged into the aquifer. So even though you have a perennial yield, the safe yield is much higher based on these alternative sources. Our last groundwater basin in the watershed is the Carson Valley groundwater basin. You will see here that the perennial yield is about 49,000 acre-feet of water, and they're pumping about an average of 32,000. You would think from this analysis that there is plenty of water in the Carson Valley for future growth and development. However, if you go to the east side of the groundwater basin in the Pine Nuts, we are seeing water tables dropping drastically out there, being mined, because the recharge is not coming from the watershed of the river, it's coming from the Pine Nuts themselves, and it's very dry and is not recharging. And then you have most of the municipal wells that are in Carson Valley itself, which has no impacts on water levels. However, they are pumping water that could intercept the surface water. And so there's a question about, are they pumping groundwater or are they intercepting surface water, which then could be impacting users downstream? So these are issues that we are dealing with on the Carson. And this is why we look at perennial yield as not a way of really calculating how much sustainable water you would have in your basin.